All right, today we're talking about theological and philosophical anthropology and ethics. It is going to have two main viewpoints. First one is going to be immaterial, and the second one is going to be materialism. Immaterialism argues for substance dualism. Substance dualism is the view that you are basically a soul and that you have a body. This is contrary to the idea of materialism, in which you are primarily a body. And doesn't have any concept of a soul. In immaterialism, there are several views. We're going to look at Platonism, we're going to look at Cartesian substance dualism, and we're going to look at hylomorphism. So in Platonism, you have a soul that is pre-existent and naturally immortal. The body is kind of a prison, and the soul is trapped inside of it. The extreme end of this view lends itself to Gnosticism, in which the immortal soul is good and the body, which is a prison, is evil, and the material world is evil. This is completely incompatible with Christianity, in which we have a good creator who did create material things. Cartesian dualism is the next step closer toward materialism, and in Cartesian dualism, instead of arguing for a spirit and a body, we're talking about a mind, and the body that you have is the brain. So Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," and this is kind of where he's getting that. This is where he's landing. His concept of the self has to do with the mind and not with the body that it's connected to. So you have this disembodied self. The third view that we're going to look at is hylomorphism. Now, hylomorphism is really just a progression of the ideas that Aristotle started in response to Plato. Now, Aristotle looked at what Plato said, and instead of pointing up toward the spirit, he pointed here toward the now. And he's looking at you are both the body and the soul, and that the soul is the form of the body. This is an idea that runs pretty strongly through Christian history, and Thomas Aquinas picks up on this pretty heavily. Indeed, most of what Aquinas says about this is copying directly from Aristotle. Now, the hylomorphic view is not merely that you have a form of spirit that is the body. The hylomorphism, true hylomorphism, is the concept that you are both a body and a soul, and that they are joined together to make the person as a whole. So it really rides that line between immaterial and materialism, but it has the immaterial component, so it has to be lumped in with the rest of substance dualism overall. Now that brings us into materialism, and we're going to look at a couple of views of materialism, but really what's the core of materialism is that you are the body. The idea here is that it's denying the existence of the soul as we traditionally understand it. Now, in Christian materialism, they still have a concept of soul, but it's not the same way that we're looking at it. They're kind of blending a little bit of Descartes' substance dualism and getting this concept of consciousness. And that's not really what's going on in the original text. But with the Constitution view, which is the view that most Christian materialists take, the human persons are constituted as bodies, but they are not identical to their bodies. And this is juxtaposed to animism, or animalism, in which case human persons are animals, and they really are just the bodies. And there's really very little difference between a human animal and a non-human animal, except for rational thought. So those are the kind of the viewpoints of how personhood works with each one of those. So we're going to get into personhood itself from the anthropology. So in all of these, personhood rests on the foundation of your human anthropology. So whatever you say about your human anthropology, that's going to shape how you address what it means to be a person. So because many of the moral questions with which we wrestle tend to base themselves on the concept of personhood, immaterialists, I think, in my opinion, come off a little bit better in this light than do materialists. The immaterialists tend to view human persons as related to the human soul. So once you have a soul, you are a person. But because the materialists deny the human soul, they have to find a new go-around, some new way of defining personhood. And typically what they do is they come up with a checklist or a criteria for personhood. Now, historically, the criteria that most people, whether they are materialist or immaterialist, the criteria that everyone's used is rational thought. This goes back to the concept of a rational soul, which is coming out of the immaterialist view. But because there's no soul for the materialist, rational thought isn't the only check box that you have. You have to create a series of checks so that you can make sure that this is actually a person. And that brings up Marianne Warren. Marianne Warren came up with 5 conditions for personhood. The first one is consciousness, and the second one is reason. Third is self-motivated action. Fourth is the ability to communicate, and the fifth is self-awareness. And while these seem just like, well, yeah, of course those things are things that you would have for personhood, they're actually quite problematic. If you fail to meet any one of these criterion, you actually fail your personhood test. One of the things that I like to do whenever I'm dealing with questions of personhood and I'm looking at criterion, I used to go to a church where we had a mentally retarded adult, and his name was Ernie. And so I have something I call the Ernie test. And so anytime that I ask a question about personhood, I always ask myself, does this pass the Ernie test? Do I get to call Ernie a person at the end of this? Now, to explain that, Ernie had severe mental impairment. He couldn't feed himself. He could not speak. He barely recognized and remembered people. He was not in a vegetative state, but he had not progressed beyond, I would say, about a 1 or 2 year old level, and he never will. He lacks that ability, and according to Warren, she would never consider Ernie a person, and the logical ramifications of that are horrendous because once Ernie lacks that human criteria, anything becomes possible. Indeed, ethicist Peter Singer, and I'm using the term ethicist very loosely, would very much affirm that as a non-human, it would be perfectly acceptable to snuff out Ernie's life without even thinking about it. He would even say it was probably morally good for us to do that. So this is one of the key problems that we run into with materialism. Now, Christian materialists try to find a workaround on this, and it's a noble workaround to attempt. And one of the ways that they go about doing this is the concept of potentiality. Now, they're getting potentiality actually from Aristotelian thought. And to be fair, Aristotle does set the whole trajectory onto the path for materialism. One could argue that most of the materialistic thinking that we came into with the Enlightenment is coming out of Aristotelian thought. So to be fair, they are pulling back from exactly where a lot of this thought is getting its trajectory. But in potentiality, it's arguing not that Ernie would be a person, but that he would have the potential because of his genetic makeup. And this is kind of problematic. Let's look at what Cochrane has to say, and he gives a two-pronged approach to this, and he says, it is prima facie morally wrong to destroy a person in potential, and a normal human fetus is just such a being. Or, even if the fetus is defective and does not qualify as a potential person, it is still a member of the human community, and to terminate the existence of a member of the community would diminish the kind of bond essential to the preservation and health of the community. Well, this runs into a couple of problems. The first major problem that we're going to look at is with the first prong of his two-pronged approach, that it is prima facie morally wrong to destroy a person in potential or a non-human fetus. And when he says non-human fetus, why this is a problem for him is because he's already sided with like-minded people like Peter Singer, who are materialist. And Singer will quickly accuse this position of being nothing more than speciesism. Speciesism is the concept that the human being, in finding itself unique in the world, has set itself aside and above every other species in creation just by the merit of our being human. It is a bias. In fact, Singer says that, let me see, Singer accuses the concept of speciesism, the belief that issues about humans should always take precedence over issues about morality, reflects a popular prejudice against taking the interest of animals seriously. A prejudice no better founded than the prejudice of white slave owners against taking seriously the interest of their African slaves. So Singer has strong convictions, but strong convictions don't mean that you're necessarily correct. Here he's saying basically that he's equivocating all human beings with all animals, and to place the needs of humans above the needs of animals, he finds that morally reprehensible. I'm not sure how he gets there, but that's what his thinking is. And if there is no soul, if there is no God, if this is all just material happenstance, then it kind of makes sense that life is life. So the problem with potentialities for someone like Cochrane is that Peter Singer is still going to go right back and hit you with, that is just speciesism, because he hasn't really demonstrated that human life is any different than animal life in any other way than the fact that we are human. And an appeal to the image of God that we bear is not going to have any weight to it. This is very different than someone who's dealing with substance dualism or holomorphism. You don't necessarily have to have a Christian worldview for those viewpoints to still say there's something special about humanity. So the other problem with Cochrane's approach, the second prong in his approach, is that even a defective fetus, it could participate in the human community. Now, this might be an argument that Singer would buy, because Singer does value the human community as a whole. And the problem here is that this is actually just, it's actually three problems here. The first is it's a slippery slope. Once we get into this, the only, let's see, with a slippery slope, you wind up affirming that because the human potential and the human biology can create potential humans, when you back that up into a fetus or into a human material or human organism, which is the language that Cochrane uses, you can keep backing up. There's no logical reason to stop at any point. And this is exactly what happens to the Roman Catholic Church in the late Middle Ages. They start backing up on their reasoning on abortion, and they wind up at the potentiality of human life. And that's where they wind up deciding that any kind of contraceptive is going to be a problem, and you can't have contraceptives because you're destroying potential humans. You also run into, carried to its logical conclusion, you wind up having to affirm that nocturnal emissions and even a menstrual cycle are morally problematic. Going back to the two-pronged approach that Cochrane raises, we've run into a problem with his ethic, and that is that he's appealing to the human community. But an appeal to the human community is really an appeal to utilitarian ethics. So, in traditional Christian ethics, we're going for a deontological ethic. It's a duty bound. It's the morals are absolute. But when you make an appeal to the human community, you're not making an appeal to the intrinsic value of humanity as you intend to. You're actually making an appeal to the utility of a person in the overall community. And that's just going to unravel. We've seen this in history already. Marx used materialistic thought to get to his views on economics and ethics, and he presented Marxism. The problem with that is that it doesn't stop there. You actually unravel. Marx could say nothing to reason away Nietzsche, and Nietzsche landed with ethical egoism. So when Nietzsche disposes of Marx, there's nothing that he can say to it. And so while the appeal to the human community sounds good on its surface, ultimately something will replace it, which will be ethical egoism. And there will be nothing that they can say to that. So the third problem that we run into is that this, again, is just dressed up speciesism. And with dressed up speciesism, we're not really able to do much more than have him paint a thin veneer over his rationalism. And Singer is just going to unravel that. He's going to come in and knock it out of the water. So now we're at the is versus the ought. As nobly minded as Cochrane's attempts to establish a morality apart from personhood, ultimately it fails. Now, Cochrane objects to Moreland and Ray, and he objects that they are erroneously concluding that materialism, the concepts of a person, have the following troubling implications, namely that materialists have no moral obligation or responsibilities to non-persons. Now, Cochrane is trying really hard to find a morality for treating non-persons as though they were persons. And that's a noble goal. And as lofty as that goal is, and as much philosophy and as much reasoning as he puts behind it, the problem is that this is what he believes ought to be. And instead, we have what actually is. And while he says that it ought to be that we can treat non-persons as persons by right of their humanity, the is that Roe v. Wade still happens. Roe v. Wade uses his reasoning to arrive at their position. In fact, the decision starts off with this quote regarding Roe v. Wade. It says, if this suggestion of personhood is established, and the appellant's case, of course, collapses, for the fetus's right to life would then be guaranteed specifically by the amendment. And you can see right here that this is where the rubber meets the road for the concept of materialism. Without materialism, they could not make this claim. So materialism necessarily leads us into a direction regarding abortion, in vitro fertilization, and euthanasia, which Christians are going to find at the very least problematic. Cochrane uses embryology to determine that a fertilized egg is merely a human material but not a human organism. He denies the status of human organisms until it reaches a certain developmental stage. And that developmental stage is around the 13th to 20th day. Now, I'll give him credit that he arrives at the point of considering this cluster of cells to be worth preserving at that point, and it's a point that is, I'd say, a quarter of the time or half the time that Aristotle takes to arrive at the same position. Aristotle comes to the position at 40 days and then 90 days for females. But to be fair, Cochrane actually has a lot better embryological research to back up what he's saying than does Aristotle. I think given the time, Aristotle may have changed some of his views regarding that. So the problem is that even for Christians, this is a difficult position for non-materialists to take, because this does allow abortion for several weeks, at least 2 weeks after conception, and this is untenable for most Christians. So no matter how much Christian materialists like Green and Cochrane try to form an ethical grounding that limits the killing of human beings, their own positions are irreconcilable with the contemporary immaterialist views of the sanctity of personhood.